Hey, Adam here with FCP Euro, home of the lifetime replacement guarantee. Today I want to talk about the quintessential Volvo engine that went into P2 chassis cars, which was the RN engine. So this is RN, it stands for Revised N or Refined N if you're Volvo. And basically it is the second evolution of the N engine, which came out in the 90s as a 6-cylinder. So some of the most astute of you would notice that this is a 5-cylinder. This is a very modular engine, and it was designed that way from the very beginning. Now the RN engine was designed at the very beginning to be a modular engine to fit a variety of different needs. You'll find a 2.5 liter high pressure turbo in this V70R, this beautiful high powered sports touring wagon. You'll find the 2.4 non-turbo in kind of your more base model sedan, and you'll even find a 2.5 liter low pressure turbo in the XC90 SUV. So if you're looking to purchase a P2 chassis car or already have one and want to learn more about the engine that you've got in there, join me as we sort of take a look at the timing system. We're going to go through the cooling, ignition, fuel, and the PCV as well, and get a good idea of how this engine operates and the things that you need to pay attention to when working on it yourself. So the Whiteblock gets its name because it's fully aluminum, and a lot of people taking a look at this engine for the very first time will come across things that might be a little bit surprising in the main construction. So starting at the top, it doesn't really have a valve cover per se. It's more or less a split cylinder head with the cam bearing caps situated into the top covers, which means that you can't really swap those because those obviously need to be matched top and bottom. Moving down to the cylinder block, it's a open deck block with a cast-in iron sleeves, and then below that is a split crankcase with the bottom of the crankcase also holding those bearings, making it sort of like a 4-piece sandwiched all aluminum construction. Now the crankshaft is forged, and so are the connecting rods. Fundamentally, this engine is very strong and can cope with a lot of different situations. One thing you want to be careful about is overheating it or running it with too much boost, because you can crack one of those cylinder sleeves, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So taking a look at this RN engine, you'll notice that it has a plastic timing cover, which obviously means that it's a timing belt setup. Now Volvo recommends changing it every 100 to 150,000 miles, depending on configuration or climate. We recommend about 80,000 miles. The main components of the timing system in this engine are the single tensioner, an idler pulley, and VVT hubs, which I'll get to in a minute. The tensioner I want to focus on because if the timing tensioner fails, you're going to be looking at a catastrophic failure. And in almost all cases, when you're looking at a timing failure on an RN engine, it's the tensioner and not the belt. We recommend about every 80,000 miles to get the parts and do it at your leisure before something like this becomes rattly or you'll hear a squealing. Because if you do have a catastrophic failure, that means valves on piston, full teardown. We don't want that. When you're shopping for timing components on our website, you want to make sure you know your chassis number and your engine serial number, because there were multiple changes in the timing of this car. In 2004, they switched to a different design, and basically what that means is that you cannot take a later tensioner and put it onto an earlier car. We have a lot of customers that kind of just buy a Volvo S60 timing kit and they go, hey, this doesn't fit right. Well, you have to make sure that you get the right parts for your engine, because there are changes involved and they are not interchangeable. So tensioner failure can cause a rattling or a chirping from the timing belt area, and it'll cause the timing belt to be loose. If you get a seized pulley, either from the tensioner or the idler pulley, you'll get kind of a chirping or a squealing from that, and those are definitely things you do not want to overlook. The RN engine features VVT or variable valve timing, and oftentimes when you get check engine lights, you'll find codes that relate to the variable valve timing system, usually cam correlation codes. There's a couple things that could be. So the whole system is driven off of oil pressure. Starting at the VVT hub, this is the actual actuator that goes on the end of the camshaft and is driven by oil pressure. They will fail by opening play. I mean, they're heat cycled, they move a lot, and they are in a very vibration prone area of the engine. So basically play will open up, it won't be able to fully actuate, and then you'll have basically cam phasing errors. Now there's a large seal in here that does tend to go bad. We have found a great replacement seal from a specialized O-ring company, so we can actually provide a replacement seal since it's not actually available from Volvo by itself. They want you to buy the entire hub, which can be pretty pricey. Now, sometimes you will find that you just need to replace the hub because there's too much play in it, but if you're behind the timing cover in general, doing a timing belt job, we recommend just putting a new seal in here. You could probably get substantial more life out of that. So moving on from the VVT hub, which is oil pressure controlled, we have a VVT solenoid located on the top of the cam cover, if you will. And that's basically what feeds the oil pressure to the adjuster sprocket. What will happen is if you have clogged ports in that solenoid, or if the solenoid itself is bad, it won't be able to thoroughly control the action of that, and you will get cam correlation codes. You can actually test the VVT solenoid by testing for continuity and resistance across the contacts. Generally, you want to stay around under 100 ohms, generally way under 100 ohms. But if you're seeing resistances higher than 100 ohms, there's a good chance that that solenoid is bad. If you're having VVT problems and you've already replaced the hub seal and the play is good and the solenoid checks out, what you want to do is pop that solenoid off and make sure that those oil galleys underneath are clean. Inside the gasket there's a very small screen, and that screen can become clogged and you will get VVT cam correlation codes and check engine lights because of that as well. Moving towards the back of the engine, the last sort of piece of the puzzle is the actual sensor itself that's basically relaying the information of the cam phasing to the ECU, and that's an easy one. Those can go bad. They're not that expensive, so you can just replace them fairly easy. So there are a number of check engine lights that are associated with a problem in the variable valve timing system. P0014 and P0026 are just one of a couple that you may encounter. Basically, when you do get cam correlation codes, you want to check all of the things that I've gone through here. And when in doubt, if you're having issues diagnosing this, you can always take the car to a dealership or an independent shop that has access to Volvo Vida. These are very electronic cars, the P2 chassis, and these RN engines are also very electronic, so basically they can plug it in and tell you more or less exactly what's going on based on what the software tells you. The RN engine has multiple configurations of the VVT system. Some, like this one, this is an NA, has a VVT system on the intake, while the B5254T4 in this V70R actually has a dual VVT setup. When shopping for timing belt kits on our website, you'll also find that many of them include cam seals. It's a great idea to just change the seals while you're in there. You usually have the stuff apart already, and we do have special tools that you'll need in order to get that job done quick and easy. So the Volvo RN engine installed in P2 chassis, it's a very simple, basic cooling system. You're not going to get caught off guard with anything. I'm going to run through it real quick, starting with the water pump. Now the water pump is integrated into the timing, so we do recommend changing the water pump when you do the timing. But other than that, you'll find the water pump will have problems with weeping. It has a special weep hole directly designed into it. In case the bearing gets a little bit loose, it will leak a slight bit of coolant, and you'll be able to notice a slight coolant leak. It's nothing to be alarmed from. It's designed to do that. But when you are installing a Volvo water pump, you will notice that the bolts are required to be replaced with these water pumps. And the reason for that is because they bolt into the water jacket, so they always come with a special thread sealant on it. And that's because you don't want any coolant leaking or weeping through the actual threaded bolt holes. Now, you can replace the bolts yourself. This HEPU water pump comes with bolts. We have an ISIN OE option that does not come with bolts. You could actually reuse these because they are high tensile steel bolts. They don't actually stretch or anything like that. So what you can do is use some of this Permatex PTFE thread sealant and reuse those bolts, save yourself a little bit of money. So the cooling system has a lot of plastic in it, and over time it gets brittle and can cause leaks. The number one area that you will find leaks is the coolant reservoir. It's basically a fused plastic reservoir. You'll notice leaking around the edges and also where the pipes connect up to. We had some bad problems with the aftermarket versions, so we only carry the genuine now. Make sure that you get the best quality product every time. Moving on to the cooling fan and radiator assembly. One thing that you'll notice about this cooling fan is that it has a large control unit on it. And as you can tell, obviously this is a used, came from the same car that donated this engine for our demonstration. They don't have cooling fan relays, and people ask us all the time, oh, I need a cooling fan relay for my Volvo V70. That doesn't have it. It's actually housed inside this. So generally, if you're having fit cooling fan problems, cooling fan doesn't engage, it'll be that component that has gone wrong, and you have to replace the entire cooling fan assembly, unfortunately, for that. Moving on to the radiator, again, plastic end tanks. These are generally common failures in cars with over 150,000 miles on it. You'll get cracks in the end tanks, especially where they connect up to the cooling system, the rest of the cooling system. And also you'll detect pinhole leaks around it. So whenever you're looking in the engine bay, if you're doing an oil change or if you're even just getting some gasoline, make sure that you take a look around. Don't have any leaks because these cars are sensitive to overheating, and the RN especially is sensitive to overheating. If you are changing a radiator and you have an automatic transmission, that automatic transmission is going to have oil lines connecting to the radiator for the automatic transmission cooler. So keep in mind to always get a set of clips and O-rings that's going to connect that up. Otherwise, you're going to be halfway through a fairly intensive job and realize that you didn't think of the automatic transmission seals, which are pretty crucial as they get brittle and do leak. The last thing that I wanted to talk about in dealing with the cooling system on the P2 chassis and the RN engine is the thermostat housing. So the thermostat housing is an integrated assembly that contains the sensor and the thermostat and, of course, the housing in general. It's stuck on the side of the head, and if you have a 6-cylinder, it's actually located in the timing itself. When you have a problem with a thermostat, your car will generally struggle to get to temperature because they're usually made to when they fail, they get stuck open. So it means that your car is going to struggle to get to temperature. It's going to be open all the time. In rare cases, they do stick closed, and obviously you're going to get right away a coolant temperature spike, in which case you want to shut that engine immediately. The other thing with this assembly is that it comes with the temperature sensor. And because these are very electronic cars, the computer and the computer controlling the fan and a couple other systems in the car are watching that sensor very carefully in order to modulate how much air is going through the radiator. And when that goes bad, what will happen is sometimes the cooling fan will stay on or come on in weird times because the computer is getting a bad signal from the temperature sensor. Or what will happen is you'll get a strange sort of action in the cooling, in the temperature sensor in your gauge cluster. So if your gauge cluster temperature sensor is doing some weird things, your main culprit is going to be this temperature sensor located on here. This is available separately, but if you want to replace the thermostat, you have to buy the entire unit, which we have available in OE and genuine. So moving on, one of the Achilles heels of this RN Whiteblock engine is the PCV system, and I'm sure a number of you have heard of this before. So What does the PCV system do? The PCV stands for positive crankcase ventilation, and what it does is it vents excess pressure from basically the inside of the engine underneath the combustion chambers so that you don't have excess pressure build up. And then it usually it separates the oil out using an oil separator, and then that kind of oily vapor air goes into the intake where it can be recycled in a closed system through the catalytic converter and not be vented atmospherically. So the problem with this particular system is that some of the passageways are rather small, possibly too small, and there are a couple choke points that get clogged up with carbon. And what happens when the system gets clogged up is that pressure will continually build inside of the engine until eventually you'll have oil leaks. You'll have oil leaks out of the cam seals, you have oil leaks out of the main seals. Basically any time a main seal goes between the crankcase and the exterior, you will have oil leaks. To fix it is kind of a process, unfortunately. It's located underneath the intake manifold. We do have great DIYs on showing you how to do it on your car. So in front of me is one of our PCV kits. It basically covers all of the parts that you need to completely replace the replaceable parts of your PCV system. If you think you need a PCV service on your RN engine, there's actually a really easy way to test it out. We've got a V70R right here. It's got the same basic components that all RN engines have. So let me show you how to test it out. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to test the PCV system on this Volvo V70R by seeing if there's pressure or vacuum in the oil filler cap. So we're going to start off, just in case there's a good vacuum, we don't want to suck a glove too far in there. We're just going to do a paper test. And actually we have a pretty decent vacuum on there. So you don't actually have to do the glove test on this per se. If it doesn't suck down like that, basically the next step would be to position the glove sort of over this. And it will start expanding and blowing up. And that would mean that you have positive crankcase pressure, and you are at risk at blowing out your seals. So you don't want that. You want to get a PCV system change. If you do have a lot of positive crankcase pressure, this one's actually in really great shape. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to test out the PCV system on your P2 RN Whiteblock engine. From here, I want to talk about the ignition system. All right, as you can see, the parts list is shrinking as we move on down the line. The serviceable parts of the ignition system on these motors is basically just the coil and the spark plug. This is a coil-on-plug design, which makes it fairly easy to deal with. Generally, when you have problems with your ignition system, you'll run into misfires, hesitations, and general poor performance and poor fuel economy. It is quite common to have some ignition problems around 70,000 miles, between 70 and 80, sometimes a little bit earlier, depending on the way you drive your car. But one thing is for sure is that at some point you will have to change your spark plugs, and at some point you will have to change your ignition coils. If you wait too long and have an ignition coil fail, what you're going to do is you're going to encounter probably a flashing check engine light, some extremely bad hesitation, and maybe even potentially stalling. To find out what coil has gone bad, the easiest way is to check your spark plugs. So basically remove all the coils, making sure you know exactly which one goes where, and one by one remove your spark plugs. The bad coil spark plug will usually be tarnished. You'll have extra carbon built up on it, and that's because the spark is not firing, but the engine is still fueling. If you've ever had a Volvo for any extended period of time, there's no doubt that you've put a set of genuine spark plugs in. Obviously, it's a fantastic solution. We also offer the OE counterparts to these. We've done our homework and found out exactly what plugs these are. I'd say around every 60,000 miles, depending on the material. If it's an iridium plug, you can usually go around 60 to 75. It's a platinum plug, sometimes higher up to 80,000 miles. Either way, if you're experiencing kind of sluggishness to your throttle response, if your fuel economy is starting to sag, it's always a great time to refresh your ignition system with a new set of spark plugs. One thing to be especially careful of is in 2004, when the B5254T4R engine came out, the top of the cylinder head became thicker, so they got a longer spark plug. If you have a low pressure turbo after 05, I'd say 05 and afterwards, then you're still going to have a short plug. So make sure not to ever mix these plugs up. If you put a high pressure turbo spark plug into a low pressure turbo car that's meant to have a shorter spark plug, you will have contact with your piston. You do not want that. Now, the RN family engines used in P2 chassis cars uses a returnless fuel system, which means that it does not have a fuel pressure regulator. Instead, it uses pulse width modulation from a computer and a fuel pressure sensor to modulate the fuel pressure going to the fuel rail. If you're having fueling problems, one of the first places that you want to look is to see if the wiring on the computer is intact and in good shape, because a lot of times, due to the position of this computer, which is unfortunately right underneath the back of the car in all manners of weather conditions, they will corrode and they'll go bad, and they won't be able to adequately decide how much fuel pressure to send to the rail. Another common problem, if you're having fueling problems, which is usually involves a lot of stuttering, maybe some stalling, or just generally poor performance without a check engine light, is just the fuel pump itself. Now, when the fuel pump goes bad, you can test it by putting 12 volts across the connector and just making sure it kicks on and sounds good. One of the last failure points in the fuel system of this engine is the fuel pressure sensor, which obviously, if that goes bad, then the computer doesn't know how much fuel pressure is being built in the system, and the fuel system generally just shuts down. So those are the three things you need to look out for in the fuel system for your RN engine P2 chassis. To test if you have good fuel pressure on a returnless system, what you want to do is hook up a fuel pressure tester to the Schrader valve on the fuel rail. You should be getting between 40 and 50 psi, sometimes a little bit better if the fuel pump is priming correctly and you have everything working correctly. If you are not getting that and you have found that the sensor is in good shape, the computer is in good shape, then what you're going to have to end up doing is replacing the fuel pump. A lot of these cars have fuel pump problems around the 150,000 mile mark, sometimes a little bit less. When you replace it, remember to always get 2 O-rings, because when you replace the fuel pump, because of the shape of the saddle, what they call it, the saddle fuel tank, you'll have to take the fuel sender out of the other side of the fuel tank as well, which will require a new seal when you put it back in. That's because, as you see, the fuel line snakes basically underneath and through that way. One good thing to keep in mind when you're actually changing that is, before pulling this out, if you tie some sort of string or cable onto the end of that, when you actually remove this, you'll be able to tie that cable onto the new one and then pull that one back over, because snaking it through the fuel tank is kind of a pain in the butt, and you just don't want to do that. So that's basically all of the main systems covered that you need to keep an eye on when trying to diagnose problems with the RN, or maybe you just want to learn a little bit more about the RN engine. But there's one more thing that I wanted to mention before we go, and that is the electronic throttle body that didn't really fit into any of these other categories, but that does go bad, and that does result in terrible idling, stalling, and just general bad performance. A lot of times, if you have a bad throttle body, you can plug it into a Volvo Vita system, either through a dealership or an independent that might have that software, and they'll be able to generally test the operation of your electronic throttle body. And probably, if you have a bad one, reflash it, because you will need a software reflash if you do end up replacing that throttle body. I hope you found this information helpful, or at least interesting. We have a ton of more P2 chassis content coming down the pipeline. We also have a ton of DIY content already on the website to help you with a number of the tasks we just described today. If you liked this, definitely hit the like button, subscribe for all of the great upcoming stuff that we've got in the pipeline, and talk to you later.